One of the things I find most offensive is that I am a self-hating Jew if I am loyal to that tradition of Judaism which has produced such figures as Karl Marx, Baruch Spinoza, Jesus, all those Jewish heretics. Somehow all those guys are freaks, and Bibi Netanyahu represents my true soul. And if I don't like Bibi Netanyahu very much, I'm a self-hating Jew. I can't express how offensive I find that. Those people don't speak for me, and they don't speak for a majority of Jews worldwide. And the fact that they are taking our safety, our culture, our traditions, and using it as a weapon to fight against someone who wants to redistribute a little money so there aren't homeless people on the street, it's a deep, profound insult to the humanistic spirit which is at the core of Judaism. It is itself anti-Semitic. I come from a left-wing Zionist tradition. Actually, my mom was Hashem Hatzair, who were socialist Zionists. One of the things which is terrifying is how the right wing has essentially captured the Jewish identity more and more. You hear people saying, well, you know, when people make anti-capitalist statements, they're being subtly anti-Semitic because, as we all know, Jewish people are more likely to be capitalists. It's like Karl Marx, the opposite of that, Rosa Luxemburg, Leon Trotsky, Emma Goldman. There's a long tradition of Jewish radicalism. To some degree, what we now think of as the left is a product of Jewish thought and the Jewish tradition just as much as, say, Christianity comes out of that tradition. When brown shirts hit the street, when the Nazis show up and start taking people away, the guys who are out there defending the Jewish neighborhood will tend to be the radical left. Basically, will tend to be exactly the people that were being targeted. So it's crazy to go after them and to ignore the right. You know, they went through anything that Corbyn had ever said and tried to figure, is there anything we can construct as if it were somehow anti-Semitic? Obviously, if you did that, you could prove anybody was anti-Semitic. You could prove that Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan were communists. If you just took quotes in isolation and said, well, he laid a wreath. I mean, Ronald Reagan did lay a wreath on the cemetery of SS troops at Bitburg, the very same force that was running Auschwitz. He knew he was doing it, and no one's ever accused him of being an anti-Semite as a result. Around the same time, as everybody was going on and on and on about how Corbyn is supposedly an anti-Semite because he wasn't rigorous enough in disciplining trolls on Twitter, you have Boris Johnson and Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon is doing a tour of the radical right.
He's going to give a speech in Commons today that's going to throw down. He just went back to the Daily Telegraph as a columnist. I've been talking to him all weekend about this speech.
And the very next day, or maybe it was 2 days, Johnson comes out with that famous letterbox thing about women in burqas. It was obvious that Bannon gave him the idea. So here he is intentionally sort of inflaming Islamophobic, doing this kind of little dog whistle game on the advice of an overt racist. Everybody's like, la-di-da-da-da, nothing to see here. I mean, Boris Johnson wrote a book which is so obviously anti-Semitic. The only thing you can think is that people are just pretending not to see it. He actually describes Jewish oligarchs controlling the media and fiddling with the news to change it to their advantage. I mean, it's a classic anti-Semitic Jewish conspiracy theory, overtly expressed, you know, in his own name, in something he wrote. Now, find me anybody in the Labour Party who's done something like that. Yet, if you look at the number of mentions of Tory or conservative anti-Semitism versus Labour anti-Semitism in the media, at its height in 2018, there were over 6,000 articles mentioning Labour anti-Semitism, and the number of articles mentioning Tory or conservative anti-Semitism was 0. It is probably significant that not only did the Conservatives oppose the condemnation of Viktor Orban, who's a sort of classic right-wing anti-Semite, Johnson put in his platform specifically to criminalize travelers. And I don't think there's any precedent for a political platform in the UK of a political party to specifically mention an ethnic group and say we intend to persecute them. And it's a very group that, second to the Jews, was the most persecuted by the Nazis. Anti-Semitism has to be fought like any other form of racism. You can't single it out and say the rules are different from some people than for others. All of these forms of structural bias, of prejudice, I don't like to use the word hatred, because I think the word hatred is overused. A lot of the people who are the most dangerous are not the ones who are inspired by strong emotions like hatred. They are cynical, calculating people who are trying to turn people against each other, create a kind of political poison, to take people whose interests are in common, whose experiences are much more similar to each other than they are to the people in control of our society, and to make them hate each other. Those are the people we really have to worry about. Anti-Semitism is a problem. It exists in our society, and we shouldn't pretend that it doesn't. I think people who say, what are you talking about? There are no anti-Semites in the Labour Party. No, that's absurd. Of course there are. On the other hand, the question is it worse in the Labour Party than it is anywhere else? And at least until this scandal broke, it was very clear that Labour Party voters were less likely to be anti-Semitic. On the other hand, if you're trying to create anti-Semitism, if you're trying to create a feeling that there is a Jewish conspiracy intervening in politics, I can't think of a better way of doing it than what actually happened, which is a group of people, most of whom were not Jewish, going to the media and screaming their heads off and trying to create hysteria, trying to terrify the Jewish population, trying to create an atmosphere of fear, of potential purges within a political party, because then people are going to say, well, maybe there is some kind of conspiracy going on. I mean, it wasn't, as it turned out, largely a Jewish conspiracy. Most of the people doing it weren't Jewish, and most of the people who were Jewish were hardly representative of the Jewish community at large. But it's important to remember that the people who were the most loud in accusing Corbyn of anti-Semitism had been protesting everything else they could possibly think of about Corbyn, ranging from his unelectability to his taste in clothes. They've been trying to make a scandal out of something for years on end, and hadn't shown the slightest concern, many of them, for Jewish issues until they figured out, oh, this is something we can make it stick. And one reason, of course, that it seems to stick is because he'd been a long-term campaigner for Palestinian rights. In America, there was an attempt, even before the fervor about Corbyn, during the governor's race in New York, to accuse the other side of anti-Semitism. And the New York Times stepped in. In this case, they said, no, don't go there. This is a really bad precedent. We do not want to weaponize anti-Semitism by using it for cheap political shots. But then after what happened in the UK, there's been a second round. And people were saying, well, maybe if it worked so well against Corbyn, we can try it against Sanders. Of course, Sanders is Jewish, so it's going to be a little more difficult, right? But they gave it a shot. And they're definitely using it against some of his allies. I think that it's important to distinguish between three things that people often confuse. One is anti-Semitism, another is anti-Zionism, and the third thing is opposition to the Israeli government. You can say that the current right-wing government of Israel is horrific and still not be opposed to the existence of Israel, let alone not hate Jews. And what people are trying to do now is not just conflate anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. They're trying to inflate anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and opposition to a particular political party and its agenda, which is just crazy. The project of Zionism meant something very different from someone who was a follower of Jabotinsky, who might as well have been a fascist but happened to be Jewish, and someone who was, say, Hashim Hatzair, who was a socialist Marxist who wanted to go to Israel to create a communal society in cooperation with the Arabs who lived there. I'm actually myself a little uncomfortable when people use, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm anti-Zionist, but all Zionists are evil. No, they weren't all evil. I mean, the project has ended up in an absolutely horrific right-wing government. That doesn't mean it had to turn out that way. I'm an anarchist. I'm opposed to states as a solution to anything. But I think that everyone has a right to live where they want to live. If Jewish people identify with this as their homeland, they have a right to live there, but so does anybody else who identifies as their homeland. I mean, you don't have to have these violent exclusionary solutions to problems. It is conceivable for people to work out their problems reasonably and get along. In fact, it requires a lot of work to keep people apart, to keep people from comparing notes and noticing that actually they have a lot more in common than they have which divides them. You have forces right now in the Middle East trying as hard as they can to stop people from realizing how much they have in common, in much the same way that racism has been deployed to keep working class people from uniting against their employers. At this time, nationalist ideologies are almost invariably deployed to keep people forgetting how much they actually have in common with their neighbors.